and today I wanted to talk about what the demonstrative function is, why it's important, and how does it operate within socionics. So the demonstrative function is a four-dimensional function along with your base function, which is also four-dimensional. So these two functions, the base and the demonstrative, have the same strength, but the base function is a valued function. The element placed in the base is valued, whereas the demonstrative function contains an unvalued element that's four-dimensional. So one thing I was thinking about, this is kind of off the dome, about what the demonstrative function is and what it does. One of the biggest things that I realized or kind of thought about regarding the demonstrative function is that it's really just giving your ego block the necessary resources to apply and to actualize what's within the ego block. So if you're in a SLE, for example, or an ILE, and you have extroverted logic as your four-dimensional demonstrative function, then in order to either structure some hierarchies and climb to the top and excel and win out and all that kind of stuff, or to understand the theoretical potential of things and the theoretical structure of things, what's required in both scenarios is that you have factual information. You can't actually rise to the top of some hierarchy using leverage in order to do so, finding the loopholes in the system and the weaknesses of the system, unless you acquire relevant facts surrounding that system. In the same way, you can't understand the theoretical underpinnings of an idea or some conception unless you have factual information fueling that process of ideation and theoretics and all that kind of stuff. So you can imagine placing any information element in the demonstrative with the dynamic I just explained and see theoretically how the demonstrative function actually operates. So you could place FI in the demonstrative, which is SEI and IEI. And for the IEI, in order to understand some of your insights into cause and effect relationships within time and the meaning of life, and how to channel that in an expressive form, it's a prerequisite that you have a good understanding of what attracts you and what repulses you, and your sense of with objects can have a direct relationship to letting out your creative passions and all this kind of stuff. And that's probably not the best way to describe it for IEI, but you kind of get the idea. But for SEI, I mean, if an SEI wanting the environment to be peaceful and harmonious, and everybody's sharing some positive niceties and all of those kind of things, setting the tone in the environment, one that everybody can be a part of, and that's also a connection to FI. If you're wanting individuals to feel at ease, then it's probably good to create a comfortable, soothing environment for them to be in. And for yourself, if you're an SEI, people are objects and are objects in this scenario, contribute to the environment and the mood of the environment or negate from it. Namely, so the FI is interacting with the SI, and if there's some person that is disrupting the harmonious environment, you might be repulsed by them, or you might desire them not to be in that environment. So, or might make character judgments about those kinds of people, or just notice it in passing, right? And because it's unvalued, the demonstrative function is unvalued, it's not something that you're you're consciously trying to pay attention to. It's something that you're automatically aware of and can manage to a high degree of success intermittently, because it's contrary to your ego block, right? The id block is contrary to the ego block in value. It's the same domain, namely for SEI, it would be sensing and ethics, and the id block would likewise be sensing and ethics, but an opposite version, if you will, opposite mode of sensation and ethics. And so the demonstrative is not trying to, it's opposite in that it's unvalued to that of your ego block, but it's kind of, it kind of contributes resources in order to actualize your ego block's functions. I guess it's theoretically possible in some sense, maybe not mathematically, but it's possible for you to, let's say for an ILE, to think about the potential in front of you and how one idea relates logically to another idea without having factual information without factual information. Now, I think logically or philosophically speaking, this would break down, because even if you, just from the very standpoint that you're apprehending anything in reality, already assumes that you're acquiring factual information. So logically, it's really not possible for you to use your ego block. I kind of just disproved myself, but you need relevant facts to acquire in order to actually understand the differences between an idea. If you just logically think about it, if you don't have enough factual information about a subject or a certain idea, how would you actually come to understand the distinctions between the ideas or the systems? You really wouldn't. You really wouldn't have enough information to actually draw any comparisons or any distinction. And if you are using TI, right, which is what we're talking about, at least for the ILE in this case, if you're using TI, I had a point there and I lost it. It's basically assuming that you have enough information to say this idea has these parts. It's composed of these parts versus this other idea that is different and it has different parts. And those statements are already basically presupposing that you have factual information or information about the differences between those two ideas. In the same way for an SLE, in order to understand where a particular system is weak, you have to have enough information to actually identify that there's some structural deficiency. Otherwise, it's just an assertion or speculation of which you're not actually really able to step in and solve any problem. Let's think about an LSE, for example, as SE demonstrative. You could use this for ESE as well. In order to actually understand how things operate smoothly and efficiently and effectively, you actually have to have some concrete thing that you're managing. You actually have to acquire something physical in order to actually do that, or something in order to, if you have some system you're working on at work and there are certain parts that are at odds with each other mechanically in this scenario, there's a conflict of sorts, right? This part is rubbing up against that part and it's kind of slowing the system down, or this I guess, yeah, right? In order to make it more efficient and to gain the relevant information about the system, there actually has to be some kind of disruptive system that needs to be tamed, right? Otherwise, you don't really have, you're not really given the context to supply the world with that information, right? Now, some people could say it's logically possible to create those environments without the need for conflict, or without the need for, I literally should have just went, this dude just walked in front of me, I should have just literally, you kind of get my idea. I'm trying to think of another example. And another aspect of this too is sometimes, for an LSC, if you want the system to run smoothly, you have to sometimes interject your own activity. You have to make it work. Sometimes the pieces within the system they're just not doing the job, right? And this is somewhat of a growth path, and I've heard Jack refer to the dynamic between the demonstrative and the mobilizing as kind of a growth path. An LSC will move from wanting to kind of do it themselves, and if they're at work, for example, and they're working with teammates, or imagine a parent with their kid, of wanting to take it over, take the reins over themselves because they trust their own competence and ability to bring about a desirable outcome, and move into extroverted intuition, where they can allow things to develop. They can allow things to move in a alternative direction, right? Because it's possible that if I force something to come about in a particular situation or circumstance, there could have been something of greater value that could have been derived from just waiting and letting things rest. And so a lot of times people, I'm kind of moving into it. Yeah, shut up, dude. People have this idea, and they get this from MBTI, TJs, that LSCs are wanting to micromanage every detail of a system or of their family. And if you really think about extroverted logic, this is kind of counterintuitive, especially for a Delta type in general. But it's counterintuitive because extroverted logic is not trying to needlessly create unnecessary rules or rigidity, because that could threaten their ability to solve a problem. Sometimes, and oftentimes, from a mind of a high TE user like an LSC, sometimes you have to just play with things and see how they react in order to learn. You gain relevant information from that experiment, and make an efficient decision, or implement some kind of efficient method there is no rule book for it. You imagine like a carpenter who's trying to cut a piece of wood, or build, or a person good with their hands that's trying to put something together. There are rules that you could follow. There are guidelines and instructions that can tell you how to put things together, but there's also experience. There's also taking in factual information. You know by the dimensions of this piece that it can't fit in that piece, just logically, right? I don't need a manual to explain that to me. So I can imagine an LSC wanting to have the factual information, but they're not going to necessarily do things by the book. They're going to do what works and what solves problems, and oftentimes that means that you have to somewhat ignore the manual. And so the greater point that I'm trying to make is that the demonstrative function just gives